Dr. Henderson most recently was working at the University of Oklahoma and was heading up a large NIH-funded center focused on community-based participatory research with tribes in Oklahoma. He himself is an enrolled member of the Choctaw Nation of Oklahoma, and he's now with us here in Minnesota at University of Duluth. So he's going to be talking about parental distress and caring for children with type 1 and type 2 diabetes in the Choctaw community. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Henderson.
Thank you, Dr. Warren. Halito and Chumachukma, Saho Chafa at Jonil Henderson, Chata Siahoke. I've said hello and hope you're doing well. My name's Neil Henderson. I'm Oklahoma Choctaw. And what I want to go over today, and you'll see as I go through slides that I'm going to compress this a little bit to zero in on the essential ingredients given our time constraints. And I want to ask us to take a little bit of a conceptual shift away from the usual target in disease, and that is the person we consider the patient, the one who has a chart on them. In this case, I'm going to ask us to, for the moment, expand our lens so that we include a larger number of people around that person that we call the patient. And so in this case, that's why we're talking about parental distress. These are my co-conspirators that you see here. At the bottom, Pat Mayer is another member of the Choctaw Nation, and she has been extremely helpful in getting us engaged across the 10.5 counties of the Choctaw tribe, and really couldn't do this without her. This is where we are, of course, is the state of Oklahoma, former Indian Territory, so 37 federally recognized tribes there. On the close-up view of this, these are the tribes down in the southeastern corner in the green is where this report comes from. So we know there's too much diabetes. That's not a news flash. In comparison to other groups, we would call this excess morbidity, excess mortality, health disparity. These are the numbers that map onto those kinds of terms. And just as a real quick reminder that we are talking about type 1 and type 2 families. And so type 1, importantly, has very little to do with lifestyle, whereas type 2 is, as we know, much more sensitive to environmental factors and behavior. Particularly noteworthy here is the middle of that chart where it says 9 times higher for the American Indian youth. So it is even required a switch in terminology. I'm old enough to remember juvenile diabetes as a term and adult and brittle diabetes as terms. And now those are pretty much obsolete, and partly because of the youth. Well, the epidemiology of this is very useful and very helpful, but it's not quite everything. So we're asking here, what's the lived experience of diabetes? But for the parents, they're experiencing a kind of diabetes, even though they don't have the condition themselves. So the study is actually closing in on 4 years now. Parent generation, grandparents, even an older sibling. And we have conducted at this point around 101 intensive interviews with family members. But these interviews are not one-time interviews. They go 3 to 5 times over the course of the years of the study. So the child ages, the parents have a maturational effect themselves in terms of their ease with managing the condition. We did not interview the children. That was not in our consent, but their average age was 12 in the families that we identified. And by the way, this presentation and the PowerPoint has been reviewed and approved by the Choctaw Nation IRB. And the parents' average age were 50, face-to-face interviews. Now, the face-to-face interviews most often took place in the family's home setting. And then another possibility was in the front seat of my pickup. Another possibility is at the tribal clinics and other tribal facilities like community centers. But it was all face-to-face. So in order to understand what we were learning, what we were being taught by these family members, we had come up with categories of interest. That is, out of the universe of everything that was told to us, we can't cover it all. So what are we going to actually pay attention to? And that was 19 categories, but it also expanded into 99 subcategories, 34 subcategories. The whole point of me saying this is just that this type of structured qualitative analysis is much more than just, it seems like everybody said this, much more structured than that. We used a software called QDA Miner to deal with the vast number of words that we elicited. In fact, if we printed out all of the interviews, I would be invisible behind columns of paper this high, a row over and over and over. So electronically, we can look for things like intergenerational caregiving, having previously coded that on a transcript so that we later go back and do searches. But more importantly, we do combination searches, and it produces a cluster analysis so that we can see which ones of these variables that are interacting are target-rich resources then that we can really go into in depth. Okay, so in terms of making sense of everything that people taught us about the parental distress categories, let me just get these up on the screen and we'll talk about it. Number one, everyone described a crisis event, which typically meant that they were referring to a near-death experience of their child. Number two, they started off with sort of an average concept about what diabetes was. We might analytically call it a folk model that then transformed into a medicalized version through diabetes education, nursing staff, and just the need to understand what's going on so it could be managed well. Number three, non-empirical environments, the analytic term for religion. It is the supernatural world, the non-empirical, non-material aspect of life. Number four refers to the collection of equipment and medications that are used to cope with this disease. That turns out to become a very important way of life, as we see in the next one, number five. So the families begin to have a lifelong experience that is entirely interdigitated with biological technology, medications, and equipment, without which it's going to be really hard to survive. And then the last ones are these. In the broad cultural context, this is a largely rural-based tribe and study. There are also, number seven, means that within the family, coping from one person to another often takes on different kinds of roles in terms of what mom will do versus what dad will do versus what other siblings even will do. And when those roles are complementary, you avoid role conflict and role stress and role strain. But that doesn't always, of course, work out that way. Number eight is kind of an interesting one, and that is that the parent might be said to have, in my terms, they have diabetes by proxy. They don't have the condition, they don't have the pathophysiology that's going on, and yet they are so absorbed in the care of the child, particularly with type 1, that in some ways they might as well have it themselves. Number 9 refers to a variety of life stressors, but it can include, of course, finances, things related to socioeconomic status, intercurrent disease and concurrent disease on top of the diabetes. And number 10 is sort of a code for guilt, parental guilt, with regard to their child having diabetes. We're not going to cover all those because of time. We're going to select 3. And these are the 3 that I want to take us through. And then at the end of those, I do want to say a few words, or let the research partners say a few words about how food works for them in the context of diabetes and in the context of their particular lives. So that's where we're going to head. And let me tell you this. We're going to start with the near-death experience. And the best I can do to take us all into these homes is to have actual transcripts from what the parent said, how they described that near-death experience. So in the next 3 slides, it's going to be text. And I've decided I'm going to read that, and maybe we can kind of read along collectively as I read it and literally stay on the same page. And then we can go back and dissect it further. So this is a... oh, I'm sorry, I got ahead of myself here. The concept of night terrors we know about in kids. And in this case, though, we're talking about night terrors for the parents. And this is what one of those night terrors looked like. This is Mom speaking, and it was his son. So we were in bed asleep in the middle of the night, and his blood sugar wasn't severely low. It was low. I mean, he's had them that low before because his pump had quit working during the day, and his blood sugar had gotten so high during the day that the meters couldn't even read it. And we finally gotten it down to around 590 or 580 when he went to bed, and apparently, for whatever reason, it started dropping, and it dropped so quick, it dropped down in the mid-30s in less than an hour. It just threw his body into some, like, shock. He woke up because his body started jerking, like his limbs started jerking and his head was jerking, and you go to tunnel vision, so he couldn't see, and he screamed. So we woke up to like a blood-curdling scream in the middle of the night. And they can't talk, so they can't tell you what's wrong, and it's scary as a parent. And he's jerking on the bed, and he's trying to talk because you hear noises and their mouth is moving. Thank God I'm married because I'm able to have somebody there with him while I run to go get supplies. Yeah, I run and get supplies because I'm the level-headed one, said in laughter. So my husband stayed there like trying to talk to him and keep him calm. And, I think maybe a soothing voice or something. I try to always stay calm whenever something's going wrong. And then she tells a side story here. Even at the doctor's office, when he had a pretty bad low, all the nurses were running around frantically, and I'm still sitting there talking to him in my normal voice and trying to at least put out a facade that I'm calm. Inside, I'm in complete turmoil. But I went and got some juice, and we got it brought up. And then she goes back to the main story. So then the rest of the night, I was too terrified to let him be in bed alone, so he slept with us. The thing that scared me the most is when I walked down there. His eyes were fixed and he was set, and I thought, it's happened, he's dead. I made one giant leap and I was on top of him. I knew he had a pulse immediately, and the way our house is set up, very strategically, the kids are on the complete opposite end of our house, meaning from the parental bedroom. I screamed out for her husband, but he had the Thunder rolling on TV. That's the Oklahoma City NBA basketball team, the Thunder. We were watching the game, and he didn't hear me, and so I made it down the hallway and yelled for him again, and he came so fast that he nearly knocked me down. And the son was not violently shaking at that time, but definitely something was wrong. Got a reading, and they were down around 20. So this is one case of, I forget the exact number that we elicited, but it apparently is a very common thing for parents, especially when there's a newly diagnosed case with the child, because they are not very practiced with dealing with this either. And so the near-death experience occurs because the parents who are responsible for these young children are new to this, and they may have received classroom training, and many of them had, not everyone had, but many of the parents had. And yet, you haven't seen it in person, haven't seen how this actually looks and feels in person. So the near-death event, typically at nighttime, the child is now going to be inert for 6-8 hours or so, asleep, still metabolizing, but nonetheless asleep. And you don't want to go in and just stick them every 30 minutes. Sometimes the parents have been awakened without any awareness of any sign or signal from the child's room, and they often will attribute that to that God had awakened them, and that's what they had to go do. It was just knew I had to check on the child, and that means they go and either look at them and or stick them while they're halfway asleep, and then find that there in fact is a problem to deal with. So the hypervigilance that this provokes, at night particularly because of the sleep and the silence, is something that the parents deal with in a variety of ways. One of the ways they do that, and I'll list these here, is to put together a kind of framework or decision tree in their mind. It's a mental map of what it should sound like if their older child is having a problem and they should be opening a drawer to get equipment out or supplies out, and there should be this length of time between that action and the next action. And so while mom's not left her room, there still is a kind of vigilance taking place, silently, but with always a great deal of anxiety to see what may or may not happen. And in the right corner, bottom corner, with the last bullet, listen even while asleep, they said that over and over, very literally. And I think many of us, all of us probably, have had an experience where something awakened you weren't conscious of it, but you know how those things work. And so they sensitize themselves in ways that really give them a heads up. So they will get up if needed and check for sticks. They listen. They not only go through the list, but the timing in between the steps that should be applied, and will get up as needed. And this often is disruptive to the family, the husband and wife. And in one case, one of the research partners, a woman, described that from the day the child was diagnosed with type 1, it was a little more than a year before she had sex again, because she was so totally absorbed and distracted by the child and the fear that the child might die. Well, that kind of vigilance toward the child is what leads to and is connected to this next category. And that category is having diabetes by proxy. So the parent really wishes to be in that child's body, to experience this condition for them, to get advanced knowledge about what's going on early so that they would be able to intervene before things really might get out of hand. The frustration is that you can't get the glucose reading without at least a little stick. And so they switch over to using the child's behavior as a rough indicator for whether problems are developing or not. And it may be that they get lethargic, or it may be that they get testy, depending, and then the parent knows to do something to find out more specifically what's wrong. And I just found that on the web. I thought it might be kind of like trying to live your child's life for you. Now, this diabetes by proxy and the attempt to live in that child's body is, again, when we look around the world, those kinds of things we would call spirit possession. And the bodily possession wish is one that's born out of the frustration, fear, guilt, and anxiety that is provoked by this case of diabetes. And so while it's not actually a case of spirit possession, it is similar to that. The problem is that no matter how the parents wish for it so fervently, it's a fantasy. That's not going to happen. And a former chair of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Oklahoma used to say this 3 times: the fantasy is never the fact, the fantasy is never the fact, the fantasy is never the fact. And he would say if people understood that more, he would have a lot less business in his practice. But it turns out that is one of the sort of hard realities that these parents are having to accept, that it will not wish away. Next, we call this emotional management, but it is parental guilt. And here's a transcript again. Like before, I'll read this quickly. The biggest guilt that I have is what I shared with you before. You know, I've been overweight my entire life, and I can't control my weight, yet alone my daughter's weight. That's the guilt. If I were a better parent, I would get up, I would take control over my eating pattern first. I can't tell you how many times I've gone, God, why did you give me someone with a problem that has to do with their weight? Why couldn't you have given me a child with cancer or a child with seizures or anything except diabetes? Another person says the following, reports the following. And so the person's going to the store thinking ahead about what foods to get. The research partner says, well, we try to do that. I don't do as good a job as I should because I do buy snack cakes and those kinds of things too. I can't say that I have a completely sugar-free environment. I don't. It's okay. Can you tell me more about that? I think that if you had a child with diabetes to be really successful, the whole household has to have diabetes. You have to treat everyone the same. I think to be really successful, the whole family has to buy into it. Okay, would you describe your household that way? No, we've not been very successful with that. So what we see here is the intellectual knowledge of what it should be like, how it should be, but then a behavioral barrier to actually engaging in it. One more of these. What has having a child with diabetes allowed you to learn about your life? Actually, being or having pre-diabetes or diabetes, it was the way of eating, the way of living. That's about mainly eating, living, and exercising. They realized the exercise was a big part of not having diabetes, especially the eating, what you eat, and the way you live. So what has having a daughter who has diabetes concerns allowed you to learn about children? She says about her, well, being pre-diabetic or having diabetes at an early age, I hate it because, she's not actually taking medication at this time, but they are watching her, and it has to do with the eating habits she has, exercising, which she tries to do, which she does a lot, and health issues that she does have if it continues to keep growing, the insulin, the medications. You know what that does to your body, just health issues. I hate, and that's the end of the audio there. The context of this, as you see at the bottom here, is that there are two kids that are pre-diabetic and metabolic syndrome. The mother is visibly morbidly obese, and yet was at a desk where this honey bun and large soda was sitting. And this is the last one of this. Those times that are highly volatile and emotional, like his A1C, that was horrible and I fell to pieces. It just shocked me beyond belief. I didn't understand it. Normally, we don't have a lot of crisis, and that wasn't a crisis, I know. But to me, it was a failure. With everything that has been going on in the last 2 months, our diet has been horrible. There's been so much fast food in our home. We were going to Dallas 2 to 3 nights a week to care for an ailing parent. You don't have time for anything else. And you feel like some sense of personal failure, like you'd done something. Oh, I did. It was not me, but I mean at some point, a parent, anytime something happens, I truly believe that a parent's natural is to say, what did I miss along the way, by blaming themselves. Well, I want to shift gears a bit here into the food context. And just point out, this wasn't a nutritional study, but obviously diabetes and nutrition are going to go hand in hand. So these are some things that people said about food. Here's the lack of resources for purchasing healthy food. So a research partner says, I don't do my shopping here. I go to an Oklahoma town called Poto, 45-minute drive. How often do you go? Not very often. Twice a month, maybe once a month. So you buy in bulk when you go. Yes, get a week's supply, a couple weeks. Yeah, I try to get enough that I know it's going to last for 2 weeks. Well, the context here of this, through the background, is that there are children involved that she's trying to feed, very little money in the house, has an unreliable vehicle, and yet lives in this rural area, which would require these kinds of distances. So what happens is you go to what in Oklahoma is a chain called Easy Mart, and you open the door and you just start breathing fried stuff, that effect. Inability to get to fresh produce. And so some of this is the distances involved and buying things when you have money at the first of the month, that sort of thing, means that you don't buy perishables very much. And so this is a little town called Tallahena, and the one grocery store, and I would call it a semi-grocery store, was going away. And so they only had the dollar store which had 0 fresh fruits or vegetables, no meat products. So again, they find that they would have to travel a long distance. So look at the Oklahoma map of the food deserts. Now it turns out, if you recall that multicolor map at the beginning of the state, and Oklahoma Choctaw Nation is down the right-hand corner, it turns out that that big batch of yellow does occupy a lot of those 10.5 counties where the tribe lives. You can't really get away without saying something about poverty, and this is a case where there is a grandmother, her adult daughter, and an 8-year-old child, and all of them have diabetes. The grandmother is chronically depressed and untreated, has been episodically treated, at the time of interview not treated. The mother, as you see there, has wheels up to the front door of her house in a wheelchair because bilateral amputation below the knee. Had part of an arm amputated recently. The little girl is non-compliant with her medications, and in this case, the 2 adults are not stepping in to be diligent about helping her manage that. And so you see a situation here that even with assistance, this is going to be a difficult life experience for this little girl as well as the adults. So, what do we do about this? Number one, we need to understand that parental distress is everywhere. It's not an if, it's going to be an always. And that, as you saw Dr. Warren's presentation this morning, you would also recall that on a continuum there, stress is one of the factors that can alter a person's life course, not just emotionally, behaviorally, but also genetically through epigenetic effects. The distress is largely due to fearing the child's death in combination with there's nothing I can do about it. Can't get this thing cured, can't wish it away. These parents who are so highly distressed don't consider themselves to be labeled as caregivers. That's my kid. I'm doing what I would do. I'm not a caregiver. I don't have any extra stresses because parents deal with these things. And so many times caregivers, whether they're for older people or younger people, don't define themselves as such and deny that they have caregiver-type stresses. Also, I think in those people, the helping group trying to work with families, don't have a full appreciation of these micro-behavioral details that the parents go through to try to cope with this on a 24/7 basis. So to think in micro-behavioral terms, the little tiny steps, what does it take for the mom to live through the night so that the kid lives through the night? That will get you a lot closer to what the real life experience of a client is. So we come back to the question, who's the patient? And if parents do have type 1 diabetes by proxy, that's something that has to be considered, as well as, I wouldn't rule it in just type 1 only, but parents with type 2 children. And here's the last slide that deals with type 2. One of the things we learned about the type 2 families is that it's simply not considered a serious problem. Type 1 families, you can't get away without considering it a serious problem. Type 2 families can. And this is a paradox because you can't go anywhere throughout Indian country without coming across some diabetes information. The knowledge is out there, and yet behavioral barriers and many structural barriers are in the way. And so it gets kind of normalized out of existence. All Indians get diabetes, or all my family has diabetes, so I likewise will have diabetes. And that process makes it become a kind of background constant. And one of the things we know about how the brain works is with background constants like the sense of pressure you might feel on your feet when you first put your feet in your shoes in the morning. You become accommodated to that. You don't have any awareness of it. It's like it's not pressing on your feet until you get home. You take your shoes off, and then you think, "Holy cow, that was a burden." And then that produces a perception that nothing can be done about it, and it is reinforced by observations that other people that I look around with type 2 are seeming to do, most of them, okay, because we only look at the exterior. And unless they've really gotten into serious problems and have amputations and things like that, it looks like 90% of people with diabetes just do fine. So I know many of you are on the front line. You're in nutrition. You're in other clinical kinds of services. And while we do commonly say, well, of course, the patient has people around them that's affected by the condition and so forth, we often, I think, give too little attention to them. And they're the people that are around that patient all day long, all week long, all year long. And so we might want to widen our lens a bit and include them into it. So, thank you.